Media coverage of terrorism has a predictable script.
It's okay.
First, a rush of eyewitness video. An assault of blood, fire, and fear.
We've had an attack.
A flurry of facts, what's known, what's unknown. Then, the candlelight vigils, the tears, the reassuring slogans.
We are Charlie! We are Charlie!
There are manhunts, streets patrolled with big guns and hard glances, somehow always called the new normal.
My expectation is we're going to see a lot more of that kind of attack.
Because in this day and age, a gathering like this is a soft target.
Then it all happens again. The cameras roll and they take it from the top.
Police tell us that the two suspects are holed up in a printing house and that they have a hostage.
And if this sounds familiar to you, it is to them too. Reporters, cameras, clicks. Ultimately, these are what many terrorists crave, a medium to turn murder into a message.
In a very, very deep way, terrorism and our modern media are profoundly connected.
Some history and a lot of first-hand experience reveals that connection.
I'm Jason Burke. I'm a foreign correspondent for The Guardian. I have been covering terrorism and more specifically Islamic militancy in the Middle East, in Europe, in South Asia, all over the world for getting on for 20 years now. The real dawn of modern terrorism is the late 19th century.
This is when newspapers got cheap. Circulation exploded, so too did anarchist violence in Europe and in America.
Because terrorism relies on more people than the immediate victims of any violent act knowing about that violent act and being frightened by it. Now, to achieve that, you need mass media. And terrorism, as we know it today, really emerged at exactly the same time as the first mass newspapers. And at every subsequent stage of development of the media, terrorism has either exploited that, been conditioned by that, or even in some ways conditioned that evolution and that change.
James Richard Cross is reported to have been kidnapped a short while ago by as many as 4 armed men believed to be FLQ terrorists.
In 1970, when the Fédération de Libération du Québec committed the first political kidnappings in North America, it kidnapped the airwaves too, explicitly using the media to carry its messages.
Somebody for instance, brings a communique to my radio station addressed to me, and that person got it from, say, a taxi driver who got it from somebody else. It's very clever.
Newscasters read out its manifesto on air, broadcasting its crimes across the country live.
It is a letter which, in effect, Mr. Laporte pleads for his life.
Experts were invited to speculate and consider the implications.
Do you see anything different in what we're seeing today than the people that you have in your book?
It was terrorism adapted to the television age, and television became the perfect stage for terrorism to go international.
One of the reasons for that was new TV technology, which allowed live feeds, for example. The 1972 Munich hostage crisis at the Olympics could be broadcast pretty much live to an audience of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. That had just never happened before.
From early this morning, the Palestinians have demanded the release of 200 Arabs jailed in Israel.
Terrorists were very, very quick to understand the new capabilities of that kind of media.
Today's violence was just the latest in a number of spectacular acts by Palestine terrorists.
It began to change with satellite TV.
Many more terrorists are still out there and dangerous.
And Al-Qaeda's most spectacular attacks in 1998 in East Africa and then the 2001 attacks in the US came shortly after. Satellite TV totally revolutionized the media environment.
Then came digital media, smartphones, social media, generating vast amounts of coverage around even the smallest incident, and helping organizations like ISIS produce their own propaganda in high definition, then shown and shared feverishly.
It's only right we continue to strike the necks of your people.
News organizations, including this one, have wrestled with what to do with the raw brutality, often erring on the side of showing more rather than less.
ISIS very specifically created content that they knew would get play on Western media outlets.
You may have the numbers and weapons, but your soldiers lack the will and resolve.
And an awful lot of stuff was shown and was printed or was broadcast, which frankly probably should not have been. In fact, definitely should not have been, looking back on it.
Research suggests showing the full horror of terrorist violence has a measurable effect on viewers.
Hi, I'm Shana Gadarian. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University.
Intelligence officials are deeply worried that global terrorism has entered a dangerous new phase.
U.S. officials. Gadarian showed groups of test subjects 2 news stories about the same terrorist attack. One contained just the facts, sanitized of bloody or panic-stricken imagery. The other didn't hold back. Turns out, harsher images inspired harsher politics.
Just the difference between these images makes people who are already concerned about terrorism want to support foreign policy that is much more what we would call hawkish. That is, they're much more likely to want to rely on the military and bombs. The images matter, and the emotions that you evoke really do have implications for how the public feels about whether or not they're safe, what kinds of elites they want to support, and their feelings about fellow citizens and whether or not they want to take liberties away from fellow citizens.
Wars to take them out, walls to keep them out, and for the threats within, surveillance to root them out.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay.
For politicians who run and win on these ideas, the media doesn't show enough.
It's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
Research has shown that media coverage of terrorism is uneven, and maybe not in the way Donald Trump suggested. Attacks within the U.S. between 2011 and 2015 that had a Muslim perpetrator received 4.5 times as much coverage as those committed by non-Muslims. That's despite being far fewer in number. Since 2008, there have been 63 incidents of Islamist domestic terrorism in the U.S., most of them foiled plots and sting operations. In the same period, the number of right-wing terrorist incidents was 115.
If your image in your head about what a terrorist looks like means that that person is Muslim and they have dark skin and they have a particular ideology, when you hear a story that might include the same kinds of fanaticism, but it comes from someone who's white, a man, and who's Christian, in your mind, that kind of schema of terrorist isn't going to get primed. And I think that also happens in the news media.
You call it terrorism, I call it patriotism. You hear me? Die.
And besides distorting the statistical realities of terrorism, media coverage may be doing something even more pernicious. According to some research, it contributes to more terrorism.
My name is Michael Jeter. I'm an economist by training. And obviously we want to quantify things and we want to, nail down causal relationships.
Jeter focused on the effects of media coverage on Al-Qaeda, a persistent terrorist group that could be studied over many years. He began by looking at major news events that had nothing to do with terrorism, times when public attention was on other stories.
A simple example is, remember Hurricane Katrina from the US a few years ago? So if something like this happens, then everything else equal, you'll cover Al-Qaeda less on that day. So once you find events like these that drive your media coverage and essentially then crowd out and push out media coverage of Al-Qaeda, then you can see is there actually a causality in the data between the media coverage that Al-Qaeda receives and their subsequent attacks?
Jeter poured over 16 years of data, and he found a pattern whenever a big non-terrorism related event hijacked the headlines.
Al-Qaeda coverage goes down in those days, and then in the subsequent week and in the subsequent month, you see significantly fewer terrorist attacks by the group. And that is a systematic pattern that you observe in the data, and that allows you to conclude that there's a causality between how much we cover Al-Qaeda and how many attacks we see in the near future.
The effect is quantifiable and staggering. On average, Jeter linked high levels of terrorism coverage to an additional attack within the following week, causing 3 casualties. It could be that coverage encourages terrorist groups to cluster attacks, or it could be what police call the copycat effect. But Jeter's conclusions suggest giving terrorism the attention it craves actually puts lives in danger. 200 years of history suggests terrorism will always be in the news, but both the media and those watching can understand that we are targets just like the victims.
And that does not mean don't tell people what's happening or minimize what's happening or in any way obscure the reality. It's more about framing.
We can understand terrorism's power to warp our perspectives and generate irrational fear and suspicion, and maybe then the medium can also fight the message.
Trying to smuggle explosives into the U.S.
That was the CBC's Rosemary Barton.